Let's see. Good. Oh, we're recording. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Here we are at the Museum of Culpeper History. Thank you for joining us today. So today we are joined by Dr. Eric Jones, who is an associate professor of anthropology at University of South Carolina, and he'll be talking about his research into settlements in the Piedmont. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to him.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for everybody who ends up watching this at some point. I will share my screen. Ooh, it says that the screen sharing is disabled.
No. How about now?
There we go. Now it's working. Okay, hopefully everyone can see or we can see my PowerPoint now.
I can see it. Good
okay, excellent, good. Let me hit play on there so everybody can see that intro slide without any of the other slides on the side. And yeah, I'll just introduce myself and kind of generally what I do a little bit here. Yeah, I am an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of South Carolina, also a member of what kind of working group that we formed called the Settlement Ecology Research Group, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is. I got my PhD in 2008 from Penn State University and spent most of my early career examining kind of Native American ecology, settlement patterns, demographic or population patterns in both the Northeast, so looking at Haudenosaunee or Iroquois populations, communities and societies. And then when I got a job at Wake Forest University in 2009, began working locally as kind of part of the job there, but also then really got interested in asking some of those similar questions there. And so most of what I'll be talking about today was the work that I did in that position for about 9 to 10 years, doing work in the upper Yadkin River Valley there, and kind of how it more widely applies to the Piedmonts across mainly Virginia, North Carolina. And we can comment a little bit on the kind of South Carolina and Georgia Piedmonts, but we won't get a ton into that in this conversation. But a lot of my work looking at those types of questions, I'm now taking a little bit of a turn and looking at more kind of 1800s American kind of farming and formation of rural landscapes. So the beauty of being an archaeologist, kind of, or an anthropologist in that regard too, of kind of asking a lot of different questions. But what I want to talk to you all about today and present today is specifically the settlement ecology and socioeconomics in the North Carolina and Virginia Piedmonts. And just to define these terms a little bit here for everyone, when I say settlement ecology, it might sound bigger and fancier than what it is, and really it's just kind of trying to get out kind of why we live where we do. Right, these questions of how do we make those decisions, how do we make decisions about the size of our communities, basically anything that we do that is kind of spatially on the landscape, where we live, how big of communities we live in, how often we may move as we think about deep human history and when people being more mobile. But we even kind of think of ourselves today as very sedentary, but we're not. Me as an example, I grew up in upstate New York, went to universities in Pennsylvania, worked in North Carolina, worked in South Carolina. We think of ourselves as very sedentary, but we're actually not. We've got quite a bit of internal migration. And so how we think about those types of questions, it's really what settlement ecology is, just trying to kind of get at that decision-making process that humans have. Socioeconomic should be a very familiar term here. It's a little broadened in anthropology in the sense that, in this case, it's not so much thinking about kind of like internal class distinctions here, but really thinking about a society's social and economic systems and how they relate to one another. Because that process of economic exchange always has a social component because human beings are engaging in it. So kind of two of the big topics I'm interested in there, and that were kind of the focus of my work over this kind of what I'll be talking about here today. As just kind of an overview of what I'll talk about today, I'll go through the archaeological research done. I think for most people that haven't engaged with archaeology, one of the questions they always have is kind of how do we do it, and what does it look like when we're actually out there doing it. So I always like to start with just kind of who's done some of the work, quick overview of what they've done, then get into kind of a current state of knowledge about the kind of native groups that were living in the Piedmont that kind of collectively can be referred to as Piedmont Siouan, and I'll talk about what that terminology means here in just a second. And then specifically get into a bit of my own research into, again, these particular topics of settlement ecology, a little bit of community ecology, which is kind of looking more internally at a community, and then these socioeconomic interactions, particularly in the Yadkin River Valley, but then their connections that they had throughout kind of Southern Virginia and kind of the North Carolina Piedmont as well too. So really this work and my work is particularly focused on this time period that is usually referred to as the late woodland period. So kind of 800 to 1600 CE. For those unfamiliar, usually kind of CE is the same as AD, BCE, BC. Oftentimes in kind of North American archaeology, we kind of disassociate it from the kind of old European, AD, BC, seeing as people here did not have, we're not talking about people with Christian religions. And so usually it's Common Era before Common Era. We use those if people aren't familiar with those terms. And what we're talking about here is Piedmont Siouan cultures. Some people may have heard them referred to at different times as Piedmont village tradition, which is kind of an older school kind of archaeological terminology, but doesn't fully recognize the connection that these people that we see the archaeological remains of their lives in the past are fully connected to modern Siouan-speaking Southeastern Native American nations and tribes like the Catawba and Lumbee. Oftentimes we hear the word Siouan, we think plains, but there was also Siouan language groups kind of all over throughout the Southeast and into the plains. In the Southeast, it was one of the larger groups. And again, most people probably recognize names like Lumbee and Catawba today as groups that are connected to these Piedmont Siouan populations and communities that were in the Piedmont, going back, as I've mentioned, probably tens of thousands of years. Most of the work in the Piedmont has been done, and I've got kind of a zoomed in map here on the kind of North Carolina, Virginia border, on sites in the Dan, Eno, Ha, and Yadkin river valleys. And to be honest, when we've done kind of surveys looking for, sites in other river valleys, you don't see a lot. I think for this time period that we're talking about, and even going back a little bit further, most people, if you were able to get in that time machine and go back, were living in these 4 river valleys. And on the map that I have on the slide, each of the 4 in each of those 4 river valleys, the dots all represent archaeological sites, which were settlements at that time. There's even more things throughout there. So it's important to recognize they weren't just in those spaces. The spaces in between those river valleys and along those tributaries were all going to be hunting territories and places where they were getting other raw materials for, pottery and stone tools and everything else, as we'll talk about. But those dots represent where they were living throughout time. Now, this is over a wide time period as well, too. Some of these were not occupied for this entire 800-year time period I'm looking at, but you get a sense of where people's settlements, where their communities were concentrated on the landscape. And then just kind of keep in mind that all that space in between is also being used for a number of other activities as well, too, outside of those communities. So when we look at research into sites in the Dan, Eno, and Ha river valleys, that's been going on since about the 1930s and largely by archaeologists at the University of North Carolina. And it was one of the kind of earlier ventures in kind of North Carolina archaeology and also up into Virginia as well, too. And what I'll do here is we'll get the next map. So this is kind of a general map of the Southeast and some of the big sites. You can even see some in the Piedmont there, the Sarah Village, Kiawe and sites like that kind of named in that way. And I got my zoomed in map here again, so you can kind of see these 4 river valleys. And then I'm going to put up some diagrams of different sites that were excavated and what we've kind of learned about community structure throughout time here. And so one of the earliest sites excavated was the Wall site, which is in the Eno River Valley. Yes.
Sorry, I don't think that your slides are skipping. All I can see is the first page.
Oh, it's not going ahead. Okay, that's weird because it's going on. What if I do, wondering if there's what if I stop playing and then, okay. So do you see everything there?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, so I might have to just keep it in that mode if it's not doing the play. Is this moving between slides here as I do that? Or is it just sticking on
back and forth?
I'm going back and forth now. Is it still staying on this?
Yeah.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll just leave it on this view. If that's working for, I do have some animations there. Hopefully they will. That's really strange. I wonder why it's not.
Yeah, I don't know.
Forward. What if I do, maybe I have to do full screen because I do have some animations here that I'd like to, well, I might be able to navigate through those a little bit. We'll see how this works. And so I can kind of back up a little bit for people to see the maps here of the river valleys that I was talking about before. In those areas along North Carolina and Virginia border there. And what I've got here is the sites that we see that have been excavated. And so by those teams from the University of North Carolina from the 1930s all the way through, really still some ongoing work there and some really good archaeological work being done in conjunction with Native nations and tribes in the area, like the Occaneechi tribe of North Carolina as well, too, at the Fredericks or Occaneechi town site there as well. One thing you can see across these is a kind of constant layout of these communities that you see, of these kind of circular arranged houses with a kind of palisade or wall around them. And while several of these existed throughout these different river valleys, 2 or 3, it's also important to note that in between these, a number of those dots that you see on the map there also would have been smaller communities of usually 1 to 4 households, usually kind of linearly arranged along the landscape. So you can kind of think of it as you'd have these slightly larger villages that may have had 100 to 200 people living in them. And then kind of in between some of those villages, you would have had some smaller communities of 1 to 2 households, maybe 20 to 30 people living in there. So you kind of have settlements of varying sizes spread throughout these valleys if you were able to, again, transport yourself at any one particular point in time to these places and see what was there. You probably, if you went up and down a river, would have seen a few of these larger communities, these kind of circularly arranged communities, and then in between them, a number of these smaller kind of 1 to 3 or 4 households, almost little hamlets or, kind of small outlying communities in that regard. So we got a pretty good sense from the work that they have done about kind of communities in those 4 river valleys. In the upper Yadkin River Valley, things look a little bit differently. And in fact, I can probably, maybe one of the beauties is that I can actually just manipulate these things a little bit so you can see a little bit. So the upper Yadkin River Valley, again, for people who might not know the area very well, it's kind of on the extreme western side of the Piedmont there. And in fact, the Yadkin River Valley gets its start in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And the sites down there, some of the archaeology actually goes back into the late 1800s to some of the earliest American archaeology. In the late 1800s, the Smithsonian started sending out the first archaeologists to kind of evaluate the mound builder myth theory. People heard about that, trying to figure out whether mounds built, on the landscape were built by the ancestors of the Native Americans. They, of course, are. But that was actually in a debate in the late 1800s. And there are a few of these mounds at the very upper end of the Yadkin River Valley. Kind of concerted or continuous work really began in the 1970s with Dr. Ned Woodall's work. And he really, these dots that are on the map here was his and a number of both graduate students and undergraduate students. Basically, they were doing canoe surveys where they'd take a canoe, they'd get off in a floodplain, they'd go out, they'd walk the floodplain, look for artifacts and distributions of them and identify where sites were on the landscape. And did that for several years, and then also excavated the set of sites that we see here as well, to these 4 sites. You can see there's a kind of a difference here between these and what you see in the other 4 river valleys. These are most of the times finding a kind of isolated household or a small group of households, but nothing in that same kind of circular arrangement of a larger community that we see in the other 3 river valleys. And so the Yadkin River Valley does seem to be a little bit different than the other 3, basically just because all it has is seemingly those kind of smaller hamlets and none of the larger kind of villages in it. So it does look a little bit different than the other 3, but not out of a range where they're not, all connected and still under this umbrella of kind of Piedmont Siouan in that sense. These excavations, we'll talk a little bit about what they kind of yield in a second, but one of the big follow-ups was done by one of Dr. Woodall's former students, Dr. Rhea Rogers, in the 90s, and she did a lot of work on social interaction in the valley and economics and kind of social relationships between the communities. And we'll come back to her work because both of their work was really the inspiration when I first got into this area, and people were like, well, we really want you to start kind of a local project in this area. Both of them helped me quite a bit and were the inspiration, the work that they'd done. They'd set a really nice table for somebody like me to come along and kind of build on the work that they had done, 20 to 40 years or more ago. And so then I started worked there for about 10 years from 2010 until 2019. And we'll come back to my work here in a little bit. So what we've learned from all of this work that's been done in the Piedmont, well, a lot of the work has focused on this 800 to 1600 CE time period. we also know that in the course of finding these sites and doing research on them, we know that there's sites that go back at least 10,000 years, probably much farther when you look at places like the kind of coastal plain. There's a site here in South Carolina that goes back at least 20,000 years. There were probably people in the area. One of the issues you have in the Piedmont is with all of the erosion and rain and everything else, those sites don't preserve very well because they tended to be on uplands or higher areas, and those have just been eroded ever since they were created by people 15 to 20,000 years ago. So almost certainly there were people in the area going back that far. The kind of lifestyle that we see among Piedmont Siouan people really comes into being probably around 1000 BCE or so. So a little over 3,000 years ago, this kind of settled, as I'll talk about, kind of farming lifestyle that you see there comes into play about that time. But they're all likely connected. There's no evidence of any kind of huge out or in migration of new people. These are all ancestors of people throughout time, and again, connection to modern Catawba, Lumbee, and other Siouan-speaking societies and groups of people in the Southeast today. So during this time period of interest of kind of 800 to 1600 or so, relatively egalitarian communities. You don't see bigger houses or people with more stuff or any evidence from any kind of historical record or archaeological record that there are kind of status or economic differences among people in the communities. They look relatively egalitarian. They're getting food from a combination of farming and hunting and gathering, which was very common across Eastern North America at this time. So I'll talk a little bit more about what was being farmed. There was an entire kind of agricultural complex that developed in place in Eastern North America. Probably going back about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Corn or maize, depending on the terminology I use, does start to come in later on, but as we'll talk about, doesn't, in some areas of the Southeast, like the Piedmont, doesn't really become a kind of staple or as important of a crop as it does in some other areas. Warfare is relatively uncommon in this area. You don't see a lot of evidence of it, a little bit more in kind of the Eastern Piedmont, and we'll talk about why that might be. But it's a relatively peaceful time period of 800 to 1600. Just don't see much evidence of any kind of inter-group violence going on. But socio-political relationships between the valleys and groups around them, who I'll talk about in just a second, has not always been entirely clear. There hasn't been a lot of research into that just yet, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is. General trends, though, across this time period seems to be population growth. That the population seemed to grow throughout this time period until around 1600. And we'll talk about what happens a little bit then. Tends to be some small settlements, but these larger circular ones that this drawing of that you see on here begins to occur after 1400 or so. Those, like the Fredericks and Saratown villages and ones that I showed a couple slides ago in the Dan, Eno, and Haw River valleys, but we don't really see it happening in the Yadkin River Valley there. I also just have a few examples of some of the very common kind of pieces of pottery or arrowheads that you see coming out of the sites. Really common, kind of the most common things you find archaeologically on these sites, in addition to the kind of where the posts were put in the ground for the walls and the houses and any cooking pits or fireplaces or things like that. Kind of the most common things that we find at these archaeological sites that allows us to say, yeah, this looks like how the houses were in the arrangement of them and the kind of palisade or fence around the outside. And then these tools kind of help us understand a number of things about the technology, the type of farming and hunting and gathering they were doing, as well as where they were getting the materials, which became something of a lot of interest in my own research over time there. So it's really important to take a little bit of a step aside here to talk about neighbors, the Piedmont Siouan neighbors in this case. And this is a group or a kind of cultural designation that many people may have heard of who are listening to this, which is Mississippians. Mississippians, right? If you know even the tiniest bit about Southeastern archaeology or kind of deeper Native American history, you usually know a little bit about Mississippian groups in the Southeast because they built the mounds that are still on the landscape. And sure enough, the picture that I have up here is a picture of the Town Creek Mount. If anybody's been there before, it's a little bit east of Charlotte, kind of down, not too far from the North Carolina, South Carolina border. And there are also some mound sites, a couple in the extreme kind of southwestern corner of Virginia as well, too, connected to this kind of Mississippian lifestyle. One of the misconceptions is often that it is a kind of unified cultural group. And really what it is, it's better to think of Mississippianism or Mississippian as almost like capitalism or democracy or socialism. It's kind of a political, ideological, economic idea that different cultural groups adopt and kind of fit into their own value systems in many ways. So across groups that we would kind of, as archaeologists and anthropologists, call Mississippian. You would have had a lot of different languages spoken, different ways of getting food. You would have some variability within all of this, but they did have these similarities between them, as when you think about, if you think about today of capitalistic or socialistic societies, whatever terminology you want to use, these kind of cross-cultural ideas or concepts that people adopt, you would have seen some similarities across them. Some of those would have been usually a little bit larger communities, ranging from several hundred to into the thousands, to something as large as, if you've heard of Cahokia near St. Louis, which was maybe as large as 20 to 40,000 individuals in the 1300s, would have been one of the larger communities, in the world at that time. Hierarchical societies, so you do see socioeconomic differences, you see differences in power and authority here as well too. So you usually have a chief or a kind of ruling family in these senses, usually having some kind of almost divine rulership as well too. And so people familiar with the kind of divine rulership of European kingdoms, it's not quite the same kind of defined structure, but a similar kind of concept there. Again, they built these large earthen mounds, like the one at Town Creek here that I have up on the image, which is in the Mississippian world, a relatively smaller one, but still pretty impressive. If you've ever been to the site, it's a great place to visit and spend an afternoon. And they first appear in the southeast around 1100 or so. And when we start talking about the Piedmont, they start kind of moving or migrating into the Piedmont around 1100 or so. And they are moving north along the kind of, the Yadkin becomes the P.h.D. River at the South Carolina border. And they start moving up that kind of P.h.D. River Valley, and they were oftentimes referred to as P.h.D. Mississippian and connected to modern people who speak P.h.D. Siouan languages as well. And so they're kind of moving north over time. Around 1200, so about 100 years later, you start to see some of the cultures or societies in the Appalachian area adopting these kind of Mississippian lifestyles and building mounds. And those are, kind of in the Catawba River valleys up into southwestern Virginia in that area. And if you notice the map here, I will critique it for being not 100% accurate, but you can see I've pointed out where the Yadkin River is. And the Yadkin River Valley is right on the edge. And the map with a little more, with the yellow and red dots on it here, is a little more pointing out exactly where the sites are. And the red are the Piedmont village tradition, and the yellow are Mississippian sites. So you can kind of see how that almost kind of U-shape little circle kind of in the southwestern part of those red dots, that's the Yadkin River Valley. And they're right on the edge of this kind of Mississippian and Piedmont Siouan kind of border right there. And this is interesting because throughout the history of American archaeology in the Southeast, there's kind of always been this assumption that Mississippians dominated the landscape, right? If Mississippians are there, they're bigger, they're more powerful, they're going to control trade and social and political interactions and everything else. And largely because most archaeologists were doing work with Mississippian stuff. And so they kind of had a preference or a bias towards the cultural groups that they're studying. And the Yadkin River Valley, and Ned Woodall and Rhea Rogers recognizes very early on, is a really great place to study this, because this is a much smaller group of people living in smaller communities right on the edge of that area. And it would be a really great case study to understand, okay, what was the relationship between these groups? It offers a pretty good opportunity for examining those types of things, and part of what we end up looking at in our own work. So focusing a little bit on the Yadkin River Valley now as this kind of borderland between Piedmont, Siouan, and Mississippian neighbors there. Again, you get communities distributed throughout these floodplains, small communities of probably 20 to 100 individuals. Woodall believe the population increased after maize came into the area. That's been challenged a little bit since he first kind of had those ideas in kind of the 1980s. Just as we've learned a little bit more about kind of foodways in these places. But you can see on the map here that corn or maize is first domesticated in Highland, Mexico, kind of near, not too far from kind of where Mexico City is today. Around 5000 BCE moves into the southwest, and then slowly moves into the southeast around 100 CE. And then by about 800, some groups have adopted it and are using it, doing as you think, kind of the traditional corn, beans, and squash as kind of a staple part of their diet by around 800 or so. But as we've done a little more just kind of fine-grained work of literally just taking sediment samples out of the ground, and you put them into a kind of mixed water kind of container, and it gets all of the sediment to kind of dissolve away, and it leaves behind very small organic remains. We call it flotation. And as more of that has been done at some of these sites, we actually identified that some of the older agricultural system that was already in place actually continues to be in many places of the Southeast kind of the staple. And I'll mention those crops here in a little bit and what they are. And corn kind of comes in and becomes part of the diet, but just as kind of one of many things, not the kind of primary food that it does in some other areas of North America at this time. So the total population of the valley would have been maybe in the kind of low to mid 100s. Oops, I've got a visitor here coming into the picture. Around 300 to 400. These are some very rough kind of population estimates for the four valleys. And again, the one thing about the sites in the Yadkin River Valley is even though there are some larger sites that we'll talk about here, they were probably just sites where people stayed longer, and the longer you stay, the more you leave behind archaeologically, but never likely those kind of villages. And we've kind of recently started to think about those places being possibly persistent places. So even if people in the smaller communities may have picked up and moved every 20 to 30 years or so, they were not, they always maybe would have a kind of an anchor point, a cultural or maybe even symbolic, religious, even economic. It may have been both practical as well as symbolic kind of anchor places on the landscape that they knew would always be there, and there'd always be some people living there, regardless of what else was going on, right? If there were any, climate issues of crop failures or anything else like that, or incursion by an outside group, that they always had these kind of stable places that they could go to that seemed to exist, earlier on in the habitation of the Yadkin River Valley. You see in the Dan and Yadkin River Valleys in particular that populations decline of 1600, that's more out-migration than it is actual kind of more increase in mortality or anything like that. And you get some changes around 1600 as you get English colonies growing, native people on the coast moving around a little bit to kind of adjust and accommodate and kind of deal with expanding English settlements at that time. And that causes some movements and migrations, kind of rippling effects into the Piedmont as well too. So part of the reason why, again, a connection, that there's a connection between groups in the kind of Piedmont and the Catawba who live much farther south now, well, that's just kind of some of that movement that happened, in the 15 and 1600s, that people kind of migrated a little bit farther south in that amount of time. So the four river valleys definitely have similarities between them. There's no reason not to think of them as interconnected and almost certainly having very similar languages and lifestyles, but there are some important kind of differences, and kind of understanding why those differences and similarities both were there is kind of where I came into the situation, started thinking, ooh, this would be an interesting follow-up based on all the work that that Dr. Woodall and Rogers have done and trying to kind of build on their work and think about why we see the variability that we have. When it comes to subsistence, so how they're getting their food, what they're eating, again, you do see some evidence, and even at the site that I excavated for a few years, evidence of, you usually find it in burned form. When somebody makes a mistake with dinner, it's good for us as archaeologists because it preserves much better if it's been carbonized. Maize, beans, and squash, but the local domesticates, so things like goosefoot, or sometimes called quinopods, marsh elder, knotweed, little barley, maygrass, sunflowers, were all domesticated by various Native American groups in the eastern parts of what is now the US. Around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, they continue to be very important in the diet. And in fact, we find more evidence when we did that flotation ourselves of those seeds than we do of corn, beans, and squash in there. And you look at some of those names and you think to yourself, goosefoot, marsh elder, how could, it's actually a really, like, when people have done nutritional studies of it, there's a number of people who study people's interaction with plants in the past. It's called paleoethnobotany. That have found it's an extremely complete diet. You've got a mix there of carbohydrate, protein, and fat-rich plants there. It is actually a great agricultural complex that in many ways provides a healthy diet on its own. Now, people were still hunting and gathering and fishing on the side, as we see evidence of a lot of different animals, and primarily deer, turkey, and fish were kind of the main kind of animal proteins there. And then collection of berries and seeds and nuts from surrounding forests. But that kind of what is referred to, those plants are sometimes referred to as the Eastern agricultural complex, was a really important part of the diet, and was a very complete agricultural complex and a really good nutritional kind of dietary staple there being grown. But here's some example of some of what, not the ones we found, we didn't have this good of preservation, but on the top there is a goosefoot or quinopod seed on the top, and then you have burned nutshell fragments on the bottom. We find quite a few of those. Again, when you think of kind of eastern forest, there's a lot of nut-bearing trees there, and those are a pretty rich source of food for people, and have been for a very, very long time, going all the way back that kind of 10,000 plus years that we see. As far as social and political organization, again, as I mentioned before, internally relatively egalitarian. Some people have thrown around this word heterarchy, which seems like a made-up word, and it kind of is. I guess all words are made up, but within anthropology, and really what it's kind of noting is that there can be some fluidity on the spectrum of kind of egalitarian to hierarchical. And in this case, the way that would look is at certain times and in certain conditions, maybe multiple small communities come together, band together, and have somebody kind of lead them in an activity. Maybe you need a bunch of people for a particular harvest. Or maybe you need to band together if there is an outside threat coming. But at other times, you may break apart into these small, even down to the household level communities that are fairly autonomous at times. And we see this in many parts throughout the world. If anybody's familiar with Egyptian history, Egyptian farmers in the Nile have regularly had a fair amount of autonomy over how they farm and kind of irrigation ditches and stuff like that. And going all the way back thousands of years, that rulers in Egypt have generally stayed out of that business and recognized that like the people who've been farming the Nile River Valley for hundreds of years or more are probably the best ones at doing that. But then other parts of their lives, right, will be kind of subsumed within those larger political structures. So we see this type of kind of very fluid nature of kind of ruling or kind of political decisions being made in lots of parts of the world. And the ideas have kind of been proposed that even though we see these very small communities throughout the Yadkin River Valley, they may have had larger connections. It was kind of a proposed idea and something that, as I'll talk about here in a little bit, that we wanted to kind of examine and see if we could get some evidence for that. Externally, as I mentioned before, and the Yadkin River Valley is no different than the rest of the Piedmont, very little evidence of warfare. The site that I do have highlighted on the map here, the Four Bush Creek site, does have evidence of a few people that possibly died from kind of violent deaths that looks like kind of patterns of warfare. And we'll again mention what may be happening there in a second. And we didn't really, there was some kind of speculation about trade coming into when I started the work in 2010, but not a lot of kind of formal investigations of that to that point. So something else that we've been kind of interested in. So getting into my research, and particularly again looking at the settlement ecology and kind of community ecology that then morphed into the investigation of socioeconomics. Really, the early part of the project was looking at where people lived and why they lived where they did. And then looking at some of the variability. Why are larger settlements located where they're located, and were there changes over time, and why people decided where they live? Essentially looking at how ecology may have changed depending on how big of a community you lived in, or did it change over time with other conditions there. The Community Ecology Project then focused on excavations at a site with the number designation 31YD173. With students and I kind of named it the Redtail site because we had this really great nesting pair of red-tailed hawks that were there all the entire time we were there for the 9 years, that were always constantly flying over us and screaming at us and hunting and everything else. So it was kind of a nice distraction at times when it's, when the heat index is 105 and you're doing archaeology out in the Yadkin River Valley during the summer. And what we really wanted to do here was examine community layout in order to study, what food were they eating? Where were they getting it from? What did the landscape look like? What was the social organization? How many houses were there? How were they related to one another? And then thinking about how they got really, when we think economics here, how did they get the raw materials that they need, and what were they producing with it? So the first part of the study, then trying to understand why people lived where they did, I, along with a former undergraduate who's now getting his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh, created this very large, essentially digital map within a geographic information system. So GIS stands for Geographic Information System. And then basically reconstructed what we thought the landscape, or what we could estimate would have looked like from this time period of 800 to 1600, creating these digital maps of sites, and then loading in or creating a lot of different environmental features, everything from getting topographic maps, obviously river locations, overland trails, soil maps, a number of different features like that, wetlands, where wetlands may have been, estimates on those. And we recorded somewhere around like 18 or 19 characteristics of each of the sites. So in this case, I think we had somewhere around 180 to 200 sites that we recorded the characteristics of. and then looked for spatial correlations. In other words, were there features that the sites seemed to be particularly drawn towards? And the way that we did that was by generating just kind of random, almost like a control group, random locations throughout these 4 river valleys and comparing our sites to them, with the idea of if the sites, the characteristics of them look different from a random pattern, we may be able to start seeing what they were choosing, right? If they were just randomly distributed with regard to certain features, then it might not have gone into consideration for them of where to live. But if they are particularly drawn to or far away from some things, when compared to a random pattern, it may have been that they were potentially intentionally avoiding those things or intentionally wanted to live near them at that time. And so when we did these analyses, it's all done with statistical analysis using discriminant function analysis, which kind of compares groups and their characteristics. And the general results that we found there were in the Yadkin River Valley that the sites tended to be farther from trails than we would expect them to be normally. And we thought this might be a kind of form of defensibility to stay kind of hidden or unseen. They're in areas with more loam sediments, which are the best kind of farmlands. They retain the most moisture and nutrients in them. We'll talk about there's some sandier soils in areas of the upper Yadkin River Valley that aren't great for farming. And even today, farmers in the valley usually add clay into the soil every spring in order to help retain nutrients into it. And they tended to prefer larger floodplains, which again would give them more farmland, good foraging areas. There tended to be wetlands in those floodplains, which are really good for hunting and fishing. You get migratory birds going to them. Obviously, a lot of animals, deer, and everything else going to those locations as well, too, for the fresh water there. When we look at the other 3 river valleys, similar that most of them are drawn towards good agricultural land, large floodplains, a lot of loam in the sediment. And a loam is just a mix of sand, silt, and clay, and is usually really good for growing that Eastern agricultural complex I talked about, as well as best for growing corn in. The Ha-Eno settlements seem to even be more concerned with the defensibility. They tended to be up on terraces in many cases, kind of not down in the floodplain, but on that kind of next level. If you've ever been in these river floodplains in the southeast, you can usually turn around from the river and look back and you see it kind of slowly rise. They were oftentimes on those initial terraces, which are a little easier to defend and have better visibility. And the settlements in the Dan River Valley were particularly concerned with being in the best agricultural locations on the landscape in that regard, and tended to really not seem to correlate with many other features there. It seemed to be really almost all about where's the best farmland to produce the most food for these communities in the Dan River Valley. So as we think about what might be explaining these patterns, I've thrown up a map here of linguistic groups and kind of basically cultural boundaries that existed in the Southeast in kind of more recent history among Native American societies. And if you notice, the Ha-Eno and Yadkin River Valleys are all on a kind of boundary there between cultural groups, and the Dan River Valley is kind of in the middle of that Siouan-speaking or Piedmont Siouan-speaking group there. And it might be what affords the Dan River Valley the ability to not necessarily need to worry about defense that much, because the groups in the river valleys around them were almost literally intermarried, friends, family. You had people probably moving between these valleys. The pottery styles, for example, are pretty similar between them, showing that probably potters, or at least the ideas, are moving between these river valleys, but not necessarily across these boundaries that we see on this map. And so the Dan River Valley may have been a little bit buffered from any possible kind of aggression from neighbors in that way. That was not the case for the Ha-Eno or Yadkin River Valleys. And in fact, the Ha-Eno communities were kind of on this contested boundary with, it says Iroquois on there, but Tuscarora communities that were there. And in fact, it looks like there may have been times where parts of those valleys kind of traded control back and forth between those two groups. And it may explain some of that kind of need for kind of defensible locations there if there was some competition for control over parts of those valleys. The one thing to note, though, there is that they are a little bit kind of on even footing, similar sizes, similar community sizes. Any kind of competition that engaged there was going to be pretty equal. Each side was kind of on equal footing, which is not what you can say kind of for the Yadkin River Valley, where those Mississippian groups that we mentioned before at Town Creek, and those P.h.D Mississippian groups, and the ones in the Appalachian kind of foothills that are moving into the Piedmont, they're both kind of squeezing in on the Yadkin River Valley over time. After kind of 1300, they would have been much larger communities, a little easier time organizing people if a fight did ensue. given that you have some kind of strong leadership there to kind of coerce people into doing that a little bit if need be. And so that idea of maybe hiding is kind of fits in with that idea that maybe you just kind of try to live in those areas and not draw too much attention to yourself if there is a larger group that is capable of kind of having an advantage if any kind of direct conflict does occur. So that's kind of the baseline of what's going on across the four valleys. And as we look at the Yadkin River Valley, we do see a kind of marked change over time. And even when you simply map out the chronology of these sites, you notice that there is a tendency for sites occupied after 1200 to be north of what we call the bend there. So as you look at the river bends upriver from the Donahaw site, and that's kind of the Great Bend in the river, sites after 1200 tend to be above that. The sites before 1200 tend to be below that bend. And so it seems like there was somewhere around 1200 a kind of bit of an internal migration within the valley to get up above that bend, and those settlements moving upstream at that time. And that map shows those kind of differences there. So one of the interesting things about this is when you look at the preferences that they had for different locations, the upstream areas have less of those things that they prefer. It has less loam, it has sandier soils, which aren't quite as good for farming. It has smaller floodplains and fewer wetlands, which, as I mentioned before, these good kind of hunting areas as well too. And so the question becomes, why would you move into a poor environment? You've been living for, in many cases, when we talk about these groups in the Yadkin River Valley for over, 1,500 years, and that kind of lower part of the valley, why move upriver in this case? And if you look at this map, you can see the triangles kind of down on the bottom of the map down there are the Mississippian sites. And the farther north they are, the later in time they were expanding north up the kind of P.h.D. River Valley and into other areas. And then, as I mentioned before, that one of the most southernly located Piedmont Siouan sites, in this case in the Yadkin River Valley, the Four Bush Creek site, you do see what it looks like is pretty convincing evidence of some violent conflict going on there around 11 or 1200, which correlates with this movement of P.h.D. groups, P.h.D. Mississippian groups into the lower part of the valley. So it may have been that the initial contacts were not friendly between the two groups, and the reaction by Piedmont Siouan communities was to simply move upriver and get away from that expanding group of Mississippians in the southern part of the valley there at that time. So some of the outcomes of this move was people needing to adjust to this new landscape that they were in. And so there's pretty solid evidence here that the ways that they adjusted to not having as good a farmland or not as large floodplains or as many wetlands was to maybe disperse into smaller communities. So not putting too much pressure on any one part of the landscape. And in fact, we don't see any of those, as I mentioned before, those kind of persistent places or anchor points on the landscape like we did earlier. So the Donahaw site and Four Bush Creek are two good examples of that. Even just archaeologically, they're really big sites, like covering 3 to 4 acres or more of just archaeological remains on them. These sites upriver are much, much smaller, likely because people are staying there for shorter periods of time, maybe only 100 to 200 years, as opposed to 500-600 years, maybe in some cases of people staying in some of those locations. So moving more frequently in these kind of smaller communities, maybe 1 to 2 households instead of 3 to 4 households. Some of the questions that remained were kind of, okay, what does this look like on the ground for these communities? Most of the work that Dr. Woodall had done was at kind of the Donahaw site and a few of those downriver. He did look at some really far upriver, but we'll talk about those in a second too. They're a little bit different also. And so I was kind of interested in these settlements that were occupied just after this move and what their life looked like after moving there, and what their interaction patterns would look if they were moving out of a situation where there may have been a little bit of conflict. What was their reaction to this kind of new landscape that they were now living in, where Mississippians are kind of moving into the area and there's kind of a new political landscape out there. And so the years that we spent, 5 or 6 years doing some excavations at the Red Tail site, yielded mainly stone tools and pottery, which led us to focus a lot on kind of the economic and social interactions around those two things. But that said, we did find some food remains and environmental remains. We were able to identify a household. And based on the plant remains that are found in the soil samples that we talked about, that the floodplain was probably largely cleared for farmland and other purposes. We see a lot of kind of seeds from kind of wild meadow plants. So it probably wasn't densely forested. They had cleared out a lot of the trees in order to have farmland around their households, and that they were using a pretty wide range of domesticated plants and wild animals as well too. Again, a pretty wide range of species that we see. So that kind of farming and hunting and gathering lifestyle was very much in place at the Red Tail site after moving up there. But it may be too that in this environment that wasn't quite perfect for them, they broaden out their diet a little bit to make sure that they're getting enough to feed everybody in the community as well too. Moving back a little bit to the kind of stone tools primarily here, in addition, we kind of added to Dr. Rogers' work here and looked at the concentrations of different materials at the site as just kind of an interesting point of, are they getting mainly local materials? Are they interacting with groups outside of the valley? And if you look at this graph, the larger bars are really just showing sites that were excavated versus sites that were only surveyed. So we just walk across the surface and pick up some artifacts versus spending, months to years sometimes excavating them. The important thing to look at is kind of the relative proportions of different material types in there. And if you notice, the quartz, as I have on here, is local, and I have some examples of quartz points up there. And quartz is an okay material to make stone tools out of, but I mean, if most people know quartz, it's very, very hard. And if you're flint knapping or hitting one rock on another, it is not necessarily a preferred material for making stone tools. Well, it creates very durable tools. It's really, really difficult to work with and to have control over, because oftentimes breaks and existing fractures that exist in it. Both rhyolite and chert are really good materials, but they're both non-local. You can't just pick them up anywhere around your community like you can with quartz, which literally, if you go anywhere in the Piedmont, kind of wander around, you're going to find quartz cobbles somewhere. But rhyolite primarily comes from, and I'll have a map up here on the next slide, from either a source farther down the Yadkin River Valley at Morrow Mountain, which is in the modern kind of Morrow Mountain State Park in North Carolina, or over near kind of Asheboro, south of Greensboro, North Carolina, in that area. And the chert that you see at the WK33, was the T. Jones and the Porter sites, comes from the west. It actually comes from East Tennessee. It's what we call Ridge and Valley chert, from that Ridge and Valley area of East Tennessee, kind of just east of Knoxville in that area. And those areas would have been completely occupied by Mississippian groups at that time. So even just looking at these distributions of different points, you start to realize, wait, this is an interesting pattern. The rhyolite is kind of an area firmly, at least the stuff in the kind of Asheboro, Greensboro area is firmly within that kind of Piedmont Siouan area. So if they had access to that, that's not surprising that they may have been sharing that with their neighbors in the Dan, and Haw River valleys. But the chert coming from Mississippian area at those sites far upriver becomes a little more interesting. If those initial conflicts with groups to the south were kind of, or initial interactions were conflict, this might be something different here that we wanted to explore as well. So the question became, how are they getting these things, right? If we want to think about kind of economic systems, how are they actually acquiring these materials, which is part of their main kind of economy, because most other materials they can get themselves usually within, a couple miles of walking. Even the clay for their pottery, almost all the food that they need, right? The fishing, they're right on the river, almost everything they can get locally. And they don't need to worry about, if they didn't want to interact with another community, they wouldn't have to. They could get almost everything they need. Wood for their houses, all that stuff they could all get. But good stone tool material, which is the primary, one of the most important tools that they have, right? These tools are being used for, cutting down trees. They're being used for butchering. They're being used for processing plants. They're being used as, arrowheads. These would have been important. And in fact, when we excavated the site, there's thousands and tens of thousands of flakes and remnants of these tools of the construction process, by far the largest kind of category of artifact remains that we find at the sites. So in order to study how people get things, you kind of have to look at the distribution of them between sites. And the first attempt at this by Dr. Woodall thought that they were getting the rhyolite by what we call down the line exchange, which means the closest community to the source went and got it, kept some for themselves, traded a little bit to the next community out, and so on and so forth. And what you tend to see is a very gradual drop off in the proportion of that material as you get farther and farther from the source. He only had access, again, he was doing most of the very original kind of legwork of figuring out where these sites were, what they were. So he only had stone tool materials from a couple of sites. The pattern looked pretty good. But when his former student, Dr. Ray Rogers, follows up on that, She has more sites accessed, more sites that have been done in the meantime. And you'd see the distribution on the bottom. It isn't a nice kind of simple fall off curve there. The SR50 site is the one that's closest to the rhyolite. And while it starts to decline, the concentration then picks up again, which doesn't seem to look like this down the line exchange. She settled on a model that she called direct acquisition, which meant that every community just went and got the material on their own. They walked the 70 or 80 miles over to the source, got it, and that the different concentrations at the different sites was just simply because some sites were willing to go over and get more or go more often than others. But it was just kind of a random occurrence as to who had more or less. They all had direct access. They were all pretty independent of one another when it came to acquiring this rhyolite material. She came to this conclusion because she found the similar proportions of what we call cortex, or the weathered outer rind on a rock, right? If you've ever broken a rock open, right, there's a kind of weathered outer surface. And usually if you go to a source directly and get the rock to make your stone tools, you just bring back a cobble. And then when you bring that cobble back, you knock off that outer edge, which isn't very good for making stone tools, and you make the stone tool out of the material that's left over. And so if communities had similar proportions of flakes, the pieces knocked off with that weathered outer surface on it, it's not a bad assumption to say that they probably all had the same access to those unworked raw cobbles that come from the source. The problem with this is that rhyolite, first of all, weathers really quickly, like faster than most other rock materials do, sometimes in the course of hundreds of years versus sometimes, it takes hundreds of thousands of years for rocks to weather. And the other thing is people were also picking up older artifacts. So, right, people 800 years ago were picking up artifacts that were 8,000 years old. And if it looked like a good piece of rhyolite, they would just pick it up and make a new arrowhead out of an old flake that one of their ancestors, had used thousands of years ago. And so it makes it tough to use this cortex or outer weathering as a measure of access to the actual quarry or site of where the material is coming out, because it might be telling us about a couple other different activities, the weathering of the material or people picking up older artifacts to make their newer tools out of. It's a process we call reclamation. We have something fancy for that as archaeologists. And so we wanted to reassess this a little bit and figure out a different method for maybe figuring out how much access people have to the raw material or the unworked kind of rhyolite in that sense. And so we wanted to kind of test whether or not it was this individual acquisition. It's pretty clear it wasn't a simple down the line model like had originally been proposed, but maybe also a gateway model where certain communities go out and get it and then distribute it to communities around them. The way we wanted to approach this, and I'll give props to a former student of mine who was a great artist and drew these images of how we measured these flakes, is looking at curvature. So you can basically turn these flakes on their side. And early in the process of making a stone tool, so going from a cobble down to that little arrow point that you're going to make, the flakes will start off very curvy. And then as you get closer to the end, they get flatter. And that's really because the process is going from a really round rock down to a pretty kind of lens-shaped or pretty flat tool. And so the pieces of rock that you're taking off to make that, they basically get flatter over time. So if you've got a bunch of flakes at your site that have a lot of curvature to them, you know that people had access to kind of unworked material. If you have a site that has a lot of flat flakes, you know that they were probably getting that stuff second or maybe even third hand, because somebody else had already done that early working and then was just passing kind of used material on to those communities. And so we went through, I believe we looked at somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 flakes. So it was myself and two former students that finished their undergraduate degrees, I believe in 2017. We did this study a few years ago, and we measured the curvature of the flakes by the method that you show here, that we measure the kind of height of it, the length, and then you calculate the curvature of it. And so we created this enormous data sheet of these 1,500 flakes and their curvature across several different sites. And what we found was, the sites highlighted in red here are the ones that we did the analyses of, that if a site had more rhyolite, it was likely to have more curvature, more flakes with higher curvature. So the angle, those lower angles of 180 is flat on those bar graphs that you see there. As you move towards kind of 130 to 145 or so in that category, that has more curvature. And what this seems to indicate is if you've got more rhyolite, you've also got more of the raw material. If you've got less, you've got less of it. So it seems like there is this kind of, down the line system going on, but at multiple different locations, which is exactly what this kind of gateway model suggests. So in other words, certain communities, in this case, if you look at like WK26 was a community where they would have either been tasked with, honored with, it's tough to know what the situation would have been, to go get the rhyolite, bring it back, and then they would then distribute it to communities around them in the river valley and the placement. And I'll throw up a map here in a second that shows this. And then so that they were kind of this, there were certain communities that were kind of the center points of bringing this back. And regardless of kind of the finer ins and outs, it does show that they actually were connected here. That there was not this kind of individual or direct access to rhyolite, but there was connections between communities. And then also you see these lower distributions at these two sites on the far left of the bar graph, and those are the sites that have more chert. And we start to see that those are occupied much later, 15 to 1600 at the very end of the occupation in the Yadkin River Valley. That chert from those Mississippian groups to the west starts to come in at that time. So the map on here in combination with the graph is showing that there may have been kind of two interacting spheres of kind of trading this rhyolite around, kind of in ways of thinking about it, two interacting groups of settlements. Now, some of it might be temporal. If you remember, the sites kind of lower, downriver were a little bit earlier and later. So we might be seeing that could be a temporal or chronological factor here as well too. But either way, what you're seeing is a small number of communities that are tasked with it, and then they distribute it out through some kind of social networks, or maybe just purely economic, or purely just communities that are close to one another. But what it does show us is that these communities did have pretty regular interactions with one another. These stone tools would have been, or the rhyolite would have been a critical material for them to make sure that they had the tools to farm and hunt and gather and fish. And so there must have been very regular interactions between these smaller communities in the river valley. I had another student a couple of years later that got very interested in seeing and building on an earlier study that Dr. Rogers had done as well too, and see if similarities in pottery styles matched up with those same communities that were trading the rhyolite with one another, and they don't. And so if you notice on this map, in addition to these very nice kind of neat shaded areas, there's all these really kind of wonky looking outlined areas, which is essentially drawing an outline between the sites that have the most similar pottery styles between them. And so this could be indicating a couple of different things. From kind of historic records and from Piedmont Siouan cultures, in general, women were kind of the pottery makers, men were a little more involved in stone tool making. So we could be seeing some gendered interaction patterns, but that's also oversimplifying it a little bit. These were not hard and fast gender roles there in these societies. So that would be oversimplifying a little bit to just simply be saying, oh, this is maybe where men and women are moving around the landscape in the sense. Now, that said, it usually was mothers teaching daughters ceramic styles. So what you may be seeing is family connections between communities that are influencing that, or it may just be, different networks of people that trade pottery with one another, and it might not be about kind of learning styles from one another. Either way you look at it, what it's showing is that there are multiple overlapping networks of interaction going on here, that the rhyolite and the stone tools are not moving among the same communities that the pottery is. And it's showing that you may have multiple different linkages drawing together a number of different communities over time. And in some ways, if we were to look at some other materials, like maybe if people were sharing food sources with one another, or if they were sharing, other materials like, you would get needles and other materials made out of like deer bone, if we could see where those are, just that you might have just all of these this kind of complex web of interactions that in many ways is drawing a connection between all of the communities inhabited at any one particular time. So while particular items might be moving certain ways, other things might be moving others, but all of them together create this kind of tight-knit community almost, right? It's kind of thinking about that term community a little bit differently, of these smaller kind of dispersed settlements along the river valley, creating a pretty strong social network and maybe even a shared identity among them. It may even be that at certain times, they kind of, this hierarchy thing they talked about, that they kind of group together or work individually as needed, depending on the task there as well too, that maybe farming or hunting and gathering was a relatively household level type of thing. But when it came to getting necessary raw materials like clay, or learning how to make these things, or trading the finished pots around, or the stone tool material, the rhyolite in this case, that the bands or different communities would group together in different ways. The influx of chert into the kind of, you can see the Porter and T. Jones sites there after 1500 shows that there was trading with very little, in fact, no evidence of any kind of conflict there. So after the move upriver, the interaction with Mississippian groups to the west seems to be very different than what interactions were with Mississippian groups to the south. And so pulling away from all of this in general, what we see is a relatively similar set of ecology for Piedmont Siouan communities across the board, a little bit of variability that's probably related to the slightly different environments in each of these four river valleys. Communities like those that lived at the Redtail site made full use of local resources, modified local environments, right? Cleared out the kind of landscape for farming and other activities there. Again, we might need to rethink this idea of, we talk about these coalescing into villages in the other river valleys, but it's possible that while they weren't living right next to one another, these households were just as interconnected socially and economically as those kind of circular arrangements of communities in other river valleys. It's just the environment may not have allowed for them to group up in larger groups in that way. And again, they may have had very kind of large, fluid social and economic networks. But again, I would argue that possibly we're all considering themselves to kind of be the same member of the same kind of social group, despite living kind of along a 20-mile stretch of the river there. The interactions with Mississippians were highly variable as well, too, that it doesn't look like Mississippians dominated the landscape. In fact, it looked like, Piedmont Siouan communities had a lot of options, right? If they didn't like the way their interactions were going, it appears that they had a lot of options to just ignore one another for a long period of time. And then eventually even trading, and it looks like intermarrying going on at the site. So not just church coming in there, but you actually see some individuals and evidence of material culture that looks like there might be people from those Appalachian Mississippian groups intermarrying into the Piedmont Siouan group. So that seems like a very kind of equal footing, and this idea of dominating the landscape doesn't really seem to be something that is happening later on in time there. And those interactions were very peaceful and very kind of positively economically oriented at that time. And so studying this area that is of the Piedmont that has tended throughout the history of archaeology not really be a kind of really high profile area to study. People have been really much more interested in studying kind of the Mississippian groups to the south and west. Several of us have argued that there's actually, quite a bit to learn here and quite a bit to learn about the history of the area going back tens of thousands of years. And also learning about the things like how are communities and identities formed in these spaces? How do they connect right to modern Native American societies? And how would those interactions look across groups of varying kind of socio-political organization and complexity in that way? Something that we don't really think a lot about today because the entire globe is kind of, dominated by nation states in many ways. And we don't think about how larger, more complex groups really interact with smaller groups. But that was the large, the majority of human history, right, is this mixture of very different political and social styles of organizing groups. And we don't really have modern examples to pull from. So these are some of them there. So, right in people's backyards, a pretty good way, not only to learn about the Native American history of the area, but some of these bigger kind of human cultural trends as well. Okay, several people, I won't list everybody off, but there's a lot of people to thank here on former students and people. And because I'm proud of them, I've kind of given them shout outs here to where they're working today. And a number of other kind of archaeologists that along the way helped me get up to speed as somebody who was very new to working in the Piedmont in that area. And then a final thank you to my wife, who's kind of my editor and helps with just about everything with my work. And we try to do the same for each other. So thank you very much, everybody.
Well, that was great. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess I'll just wrap things up. Thank you, everybody, for watching today. I hope you enjoyed, especially if you're interested about trying to learn a little bit more about Native Americans in the area, especially further south in the Piedmont. All right. Well, thank you. And thank you on behalf of the Museum of Cultural History. And thank you so much, Eric, for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Great. Love this outreach. And I believe if my email and stuff is available, people can reach out if they ever have questions about archaeology of the area or anything else. More than happy to do the public outreach with people. Anybody who wants to learn about archaeology, we're here for them.
Great. Thank you.